September 7, 1939, brought with it the relentless mechanized thunder of a world being torn apart. In just 1 week, the German war machine had proven its terrifying efficiency, slicing through Polish defenses with a brutal speed that left nations reeling. The strategy was blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it seemed unstoppable. Amid the chaos and the collapsing front lines, a specific chilling order traveled down the chain of command to a young Polish captain, the Władysław Raginis. He was to take his position in the marshy, river-cut landscape around Wizna and hold it. The command was absolute and unforgiving. Hold at all costs. The force Captain Raginis commanded was dwarfed by the scale of his task. Under his command were 720 men, a mixture of soldiers and border guards, and a scant collection of artillery, including a mere 24 pieces and about 20 machine guns. These men were the thin, green line guarding a strategic river crossing. But what was coming for them was not merely an enemy battalion or regiment. It was the full, crushing weight of General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, a spearhead of the German invasion force renowned for its power and mobility. This colossal formation numbered over 40,000 elite soldiers, backed by the roaring engines of 350 tanks and the terrifying, shrieking dive bombers of the Luftwaffe. To speak of odds in this scenario feels almost meaningless. It was a confrontation between a pebble and a landslide. Yet, it is in these very moments, when hope is extinguished by cold, hard arithmetic, that legend finds its fuel. For the next 3 days, this small patch of Poland would not simply be a battlefield. It would become an altar. The men at Wizna were not fighting for victory in a conventional sense, for that was already impossible. They were fighting for something more profound, for honor, for time, and for the very soul of a nation refusing to vanish without a testament to its courage. Their stand would become so deeply etched into the fabric of history that it would earn a somber and powerful comparison: the Polish Thermopylae. To fully grasp the immense pressure bearing down on the defenders of Wizna, one must first understand the catastrophic strategic picture of Poland in early September 1939. The German invasion, launched on September 1st, was not a single-front assault but a vast coordinated pincer movement designed to encircle and annihilate the Polish armed forces west of the Vistula River. From the west, Army Group South drove towards Warsaw, while from the north, Army Group North pushed down from Pomerania and East Prussia. The Polish military, valiant but outmoded in its doctrine and hopelessly outmatched in the air, was forced to fight on multiple collapsing fronts, its units often isolated and unable to form a coherent defensive line. It was within this maelstrom that the specific role of General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps becomes clear. This formation, a potent symbol of the new German blitzkrieg warfare, was part of Army Group North. After its initial successes, its objective was to execute a deep, sweeping maneuver from its staging grounds in East Prussia, racing south and east to sever Polish lines of communication and retreat. Its ultimate goal was to complete the larger encirclement, trapping the Polish units defending the western approaches in a massive pocket. The geographical key to this entire operation was the Nera River, a significant waterway that acted as a natural defensive barrier for central Poland. The German High Command identified the crossing points around the village of Wizna as absolutely critical. Control of this sector would allow the 19th Panzer Corps to burst across the river, swing behind the Polish formations fighting to the west, and effectively slam the back door shut, sealing their fate. For the Poles, the Wizna fortified area was therefore not just a local defensive position. It was the linchpin holding the entire Nera River line. Its fall would mean an unimpeded German advance into the vulnerable heartland of the country, enabling a swift link-up with other German forces and ensuring the rapid collapse of organized national resistance. The defenders at Wizna were, in effect, guarding the main gate, and the German command was prepared to throw an overwhelming force at it to ensure that gate was smashed open. The monumental task of defending this gateway fell to Captain Władysław Raginis, a 31-year-old officer whose character would become as central to the legend of Wizna as the battle itself. A graduate of the prestigious Polish officer school in Warsaw, Raginis was described by his contemporaries as a calm, meticulous, and deeply dedicated soldier, known for his sense of duty and his concern for the men under his command. He was not a flamboyant or fiery leader, but one whose quiet resolve and professional competence inspired confidence. In August of 1939, as war clouds gathered, he was given command of the Wizna sector, a responsibility that would test the very limits of human endurance. His domain was the Ciechano fortified area, a defensive line still under construction that stretched approximately 9 kilometers between the villages of Wizna and Gielksen. This line consisted of just 16 bunkers, a mix of heavy, reinforced concrete structures and lighter, more rudimentary field works. Only 6 of these were the modern, resilient heavy bunkers. The rest were lighter machine gun nests, offering limited protection against direct hits from heavy artillery or aerial bombs. The defensive philosophy behind this line was one of mutual support, where bunkers were positioned to cover each other with interlocking fields of fire. However, the system had critical weaknesses. The bunkers were spread thinly across the landscape, and the dense forests and marshy terrain of the narrow valley often limited their fields of view and fire. Crucially, the line lacked significant depth, meaning that once the forward positions were penetrated, there were few fallback options. Raginis's garrison was a mixed force of around 720 men, primarily from the 8th Company of the 135th Infantry Regiment and the 3rd Company of the Osoyek Fortress Battalion, bolstered by a platoon of engineers and artillerymen operating a handful of antiquated pieces and anti-tank guns. These were not elite shock troops, but regular soldiers and border guards, many of whom were deeply connected to the local region they were now tasked with defending. They were hopelessly outgunned in every conceivable category: manpower, armor, and air power. Yet, under Raginis's command, this small, isolated force would transform a collection of concrete and earthworks into a symbol of unyielding resistance, a testament to the power of a determined human spirit standing against a mechanized juggernaut. The initial phase of the battle began not with a cataclysmic clash, but with the tense, probing actions of a vanguard. On September 7th, advance elements of the German 10th Panzer Division reached the outskirts of the Wizna defensive line. What followed were sharp initial skirmishes as the Germans tested the Polish perimeter, seeking weak points and gauging the strength and disposition of Raginis's forces. The Polish defenders, well concealed in their bunkers and field fortifications, met these probes with disciplined rifle and machine gun fire, successfully repelling the early attempts to breach their line. This first day was a grim prelude, a demonstration that the Polish position was manned by a determined enemy, but it was a mere whisper of the storm to come. For 2 days, a tense and ominous quiet settled over the sector, broken only by sporadic artillery fire and the constant, unnerving movement of German forces massing just beyond the Polish line of sight. The defenders used this time to further strengthen their positions and brace for the inevitable main assault, knowing that the reconnaissance in force was over. The Germans had identified the obstacle, and now they would bring their full terrifying weight to bear upon it. The true, unadulterated hell of modern warfare descended upon Wizna on the morning of September 9th. The relative silence was shattered by the rising, screaming whine of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers peeling out of the sky. These were not just aircraft. They were psychological weapons, their signature Jericho trumpets emitting a siren meant to paralyze men with fear before the bombs even fell. With brutal precision, they began a systematic demolition of the Polish defenses. One by one, the bunkers became targets. The earth erupted in great geysers of soil and concrete dust as high-explosive bombs detonated across the landscape. The goal was not merely to destroy the fortifications physically but to break the defenders spiritually. Communication lines, the nervous system of Raginis's command, were severed almost immediately, isolating the bunkers from one another and from their commander. Inside the reinforced concrete casemates, the world dissolved into a deafening, shaking chaos. The very ground trembled incessantly, a constant, physical vibration that mirrored the psychological torment of men enduring what seemed like an unstoppable, impersonal annihilation from the air. Even before the dust from the aerial bombardment had settled, the second terrestrial wave of the German assault began to roll forward. With the defensive line reeling from the air attack, General Guderian committed his ground forces in a massive coordinated push intended to overrun the dazed and isolated Polish positions. The initial German advance, however, met with a resistance so ferocious and effective that it defied all logical expectation. As German infantry, supported by Panzer III and IV tanks, advanced across the open fields and through the marshes, they were met with a storm of fire from the Polish bunkers that had, against all odds, survived the aerial onslaught. The Polish defenders, though isolated and deafened, had held their discipline. From carefully designed firing ports, their machine guns, particularly the reliable WZ-30 and the formidable CKM WZ.30 heavy machine guns, unleashed interlocking bands of fire that scythed through the advancing German infantry. The Polish anti-tank capabilities, though limited, also proved devastatingly effective at close range. Their 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns, along with a small number of potent Marazek WZ.35 anti-tank rifles, weapons capable of piercing the armor of the lighter German tanks at several hundred meters, exacted a heavy toll on the panzers. Several German tanks were knocked out, burning on the approaches to the Polish line, their smoke adding to the haze of battle. The German advance, envisioned as a swift, crushing blow, quickly degenerated into a brutal close-quarters infantry battle. The isolated Polish bunkers became individual islands of fierce resistance, each one having to be reduced through a painstaking and bloody process. The initial confidence of the German command turned to shock and frustration. The sheer disproportionate violence of the Polish defense had, against all odds, caused the mighty 19th Panzer Corps to falter. The Blitzkrieg advance, for the first time in the campaign, had ground to a bloody, unexpected, and humiliating halt before a tiny, determined force. The initial German shock at the ferocity of the defense quickly gave way to a methodical and brutal process of annihilation. The Polish bunkers, though proving their resilience, were not impervious, and their greatest weakness, their isolation, was now being exploited with ruthless efficiency. With field telephones lines shredded by artillery and runners unable to break through the tightening German cordon, each bunker was transformed into an independent, besieged fortress, fighting its own private war in a vacuum of information and hope. There would be no relief, no reinforcements, and no falling back to a secondary line. The battle had devolved into a series of desperate last stands. German combat engineers, pioneers specializing in close assault siege warfare, now took center stage. Protected by suppressive fire from tanks and infantry, these teams would advance on the silent but still dangerous concrete pillboxes, using flamethrowers to blast jets of fire through firing ports, choking the defenders with smoke and searing heat, and placing shaped explosive charges directly against the steel doors and reinforced walls. They began the systematic work of breaking the Polish strongpoints one by one. The fall of each bunker was often signaled by a final, violent explosion, followed by an ominous silence that further constricted the defensive perimeter. As September 10th wore on, the Polish line crumbled. The geography of resistance shrank relentlessly, compressed by overwhelming force. The northern sector of the defense was overrun, and the focal point of the battle converged on a small hill near the village of Gielksen. Here, the command bunker of Captain Władysław Raginis and the nearby bunker of his second-in-command, Lieutenant Stanislaw Brajkowski, became the final bastions of Polish defiance. These two positions were now the heart of a defense that had a pulse but no longer a body. They were surrounded, pounded by direct fire from artillery and tanks, and under constant assault. Lieutenant Brajkowski's bunker was eventually silenced, its crew killed or incapacitated. The noose was drawn tight around Raginis himself. Inside his command bunker, the air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic scent of blood. The sounds of battle outside were now immediate and personal. The crunch of German boots on the rubble above, the shouted commands, the scraping of equipment as the final assault was prepared. The captain, wounded by shrapnel and concussed from the relentless bombardment, stood with his few remaining able-bodied men, facing the inevitable end. The final act of the Battle of Wizna was not dictated by a further exchange of gunfire, but by a moment of profound moral choice. The German command, exasperated by the costly delay and the stubborn refusal of this last pocket to die, opted for a different tactic. A white flag was raised, and a German envoy, often identified as a junior officer, was sent forward to parley. The message delivered to the battered defenders in the command bunker was stark and brutal. Surrender immediately, or the Germans would execute every Polish prisoner they had taken during the assault on the Wizna line. This was not a request. It was an ultimatum that placed the weight of his comrades' lives directly upon Captain Raginis' shoulders. He was confronted with an impossible dilemma. Continue a fight that was already militarily lost, ensuring the death of his remaining men and the execution of prisoners, or lay down arms in defiance of his sacred duty. For Raginis, however, the calculus of this decision had already been settled days before. At the outset of the battle, he and his fellow officers had sworn a solemn oath to their commander, Major Jakob Faber. They had pledged to defend their assigned positions to the uttermost, vowing that they would only leave their posts upon death. This oath was the bedrock of his command, the spiritual core that had sustained the defense against impossible material odds. To surrender would be to break his word, to invalidate the sacrifice of every soldier who had already fallen under his command. In this crucible of fire and duty, Raginis found his final resolution. He would not surrender, but he would not compel his remaining soldiers to share his fate. He ordered the few wounded and exhausted men with him to lay down their weapons and exit the bunker, saving them from certain death. They obeyed their captain's final command, leaving him alone in the smoky, ruined interior. Having ensured the survival of his men and with the German threat to the prisoners presumably averted, Raginis was free to fulfill the only promise left that he could keep. The sound of a single grenade explosion from within the bunker marked the end of the battle. Captain Władysław Raginis, by taking his own life, had remained true to his oath. He held his position at all costs, and he left it only in death. The battlefield, when finally silent, presented a harrowing tableau of the price paid for those 3 days. The Polish defense was virtually annihilated. Of the approximately 720 men who stood with Captain Raginis at the start of the battle, only a handful survived, having been ordered to surrender by their commander at the very end or by some miracle escaping the encirclement. The rest lay dead in their shattered bunkers and field positions, having made the ultimate sacrifice. The German victors, though they held the field, had paid a far heavier price than anticipated for such a small sector of the front. Estimates of their losses vary, but conservative figures suggest between 900 and 1,300 German soldiers were killed or wounded, with several dozen armored vehicles and tanks destroyed or disabled in the intense fighting. The disparity in forces made these German casualties profoundly significant. It represented a stunning tactical and moral victory snatched from the jaws of certain military defeat. The ultimate strategic value of this sacrifice has been the subject of historical discussion, but its importance cannot be dismissed. The tenacious defense of the Wizna line pinned down the entire 19th Panzer Corps for a critical 3-day period. In a blitzkrieg campaign where speed and momentum were everything, this delay was a major disruption to the German operational timetable. The fierce resistance at Wizna, along with other stubborn Polish stands, bought invaluable time for larger Polish formations, such as the Independent Operational Group Neru and units retreating from the west, to disengage and fall back towards Warsaw and the Greater Brest Fortress, avoiding immediate encirclement and destruction. While it could not alter the inevitable outcome of the September campaign, the battle allowed these units to regroup and live to fight another day, prolonging the Polish defense and contributing to the overall narrative of a nation that refused to capitulate without a fierce struggle. The men at Wizna did not just die for a patch of marshland. They purchased time with their blood, and in the context of a desperate nationwide defense, time was a commodity more precious than territory. In the years that followed, the story of Wizna transcended its military details to become a powerful national legend, earning its enduring nickname as the Polish Thermopylae. The parallel is poignant and profound. Just as the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae chose certain death against an overwhelming Persian force to defend the ideals of Greek freedom, so too did Raginis and his men stand against the Nazi onslaught for the soul of Poland. Both were decisive defeats in a tactical sense, yet both were transformed into profound moral and spiritual victories. The battle came to perfectly embody the Polish national ethos of do ostatniej kropli krwi, to the last drop of blood, and the concept of honor held so sacred that it is valued above life itself. Raginis's personal oath and his final solitary act became the ultimate expression of this principle, elevating him and his men to the status of national martyrs and eternal symbols of resistance. The memory of Wizna has been carefully preserved and honored in modern Poland. A stark, solemn memorial stands on the site today, a place of pilgrimage where veterans, schoolchildren, and state officials gather to pay their respects. The legend, however, has also found a powerful new life in global popular culture, largely thanks to the Swedish heavy metal band Sabaton. Their 2008 song 40:1, titled for the approximate odds faced by the defenders, masterfully retold the story with driving intensity, introducing the Battle of Wizna to millions of listeners around the world who may have never otherwise encountered it. The song's chorus, echoing the defiance of the Polish soldiers, cemented the battle's epic status for a new generation. This fusion of historical memory with modern media ensures that the sacrifice of Captain Raginis and his men is no longer just a Polish story, but a universal one, a timeless testament to the power of human courage in the face of impossible odds.